Hello, and welcome to another episode of No Notes, where the conversation is always a perfect 10 out of 10. This podcast is powered by Elios, the most used and most loved AI platform in behavioral health, equipping more than 130 organizations and tens of thousands of providers with powerful automation tools that streamline documentation, simplify compliance, and surface deep care insights that drive better client outcomes. I'm your host, Dr. Denny Morrison, and for today's episode, we are excited to be joined by Laura Siclari, managing partner of Siclari Law Group. We'll chat about how AI can help behavioral health providers avoid non compliant documentation, billing errors, and even legal claims. We'll also explore best practices for implementing AI solutions that prioritize risk reduction and legal protection. So, welcome, Laura, and thank you so much for being here today.
You're very welcome, and I'm very glad to be here talking with you all.
Well, it's great that and this compliance topic is really hot these days. Tell us a little bit about how you got into this business and what your background's like.
Sure. So I've been an attorney for over 20 years, but I started out doing some environmental work and then transitioned over to employment law. And from there, general counsel work. Behavioral health companies have been a real interest of mine for a lot of years because I have a niche education law practice where I represent a lot of students and over the years is students with behavioral health issues. So I ended up joining a board about 18 years ago in Care Plus New Jersey. So they are a large behavioral health and addiction community health provider based in Paramus, New Jersey, but really expanded a lot throughout New Jersey. I went from being on their board to chairing their board for over 10 years, which, really when you work that closely with a CEO as a board chair, you really get to know the ins and outs of the organizations, the risks, the compliance, the auditing, and all of those things. And then when I transitioned off the board, they invited me to be their outside general counsel. So that began some of my specialty work in the areas of behavioral and addiction spaces. And I have a very unique subscription model that is, I would say, uniquely tailored to nonprofits, being able to use an attorney at a flat monthly fee instead of having to be worried about the friction point of the hourly billing and, oh no, how much is my lawyer going to charge me this month? We just remove the billing right outside. So this is one of my favorite things to do is to counsel behavioral health and addictions organizations because they provide a true safety net to, I mean, truly our most vulnerable individuals in our state and country. So that's where I'm at, and I just keep growing and growing. So it's amazing to be working with folks like you guys that are also at the head of the curve on this.
Thanks. And yeah, New Jersey is a friend of ours, and Care Plus, particularly Joe Mashendero, who you worked with closely, is an old friend of mine, and we've actually had him on the podcast before. So it's
Oh, I didn't
uh,
know that. That's
yeah.
amazing.
So hey,
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about your perceptions about AI and how can it help behavioral health organizations with their documentation and billing compliance.
I think AI really offers behavioral health organizations really an unprecedented opportunity to strengthen their document accuracy and their billing compliance. You can't automate everything, and you certainly can't take the place of human and clinical review by a human, but you certainly can automate certain things that can get folks in trouble on the documentation and compliance side, real time review of clinical notes against payer requirements, noting inconsistencies, improper coding, upcoding, downcoding, all of those things. Can, help over time to save a company time in the long term to hopefully avoid audits and, avoid problems with payer challenges. So really the sky's the limit in so many ways.
Well, when you advise behavioral health organizations, what do you see as the most common errors that they make in terms of compliance? Personally, I would have argued things like copying and pasting notes, but I don't know if that's true.
So certainly copying and pasting notes is a real thing that does happen. I'm not saying all clinicians do it, but some do. And I would say the reason that clinicians sometimes cut corners in their notes is really not from any kind of a nefarious reasons, but that they just are really overbooked during the day with back-to-back clinical appointments, and they're up, late at night sometimes trying to catch up from the day and to get clinical notes in. And sometimes you may find that the end result is shortcuts like copying, pasting notes, or just doing insufficient notes that are too bare bones and don't really reflect what went on in the session and what the goals are. And you're not kind of meeting the standards of care at that point when your notes don't contain everything they need to. So those I would say are the two biggest ones. And again, it all comes down to, clinical time management and burnout that I think would be a big part of it.
Yeah, I think those two issues are related. You tend to get insufficient and inappropriate notes when somebody has waited too long to do their documentation. And so when they try to do it without copying and pasting, they will shortcut the note and because they can't remember what happened. I mean, you figure some of these clinicians are seeing 6, 7 clients a day on an outpatient basis. If you let that go for a few days, I can tell you as a former clinician, it is almost impossible to remember exactly what happened in each session.
Right. And not only that, and sometimes, in all fairness, it's not always the clinician's fault where they, put it off. It may be that their schedule is so jammed with back to back clinical sessions that, there's always a balancing act of trying to be a true empathetic listener and focus totally on the client versus trying to take contemporaneous notes at the same time, where you unfortunately may only be half listening if you're also writing your clinical note at the same time. And I can remember, my son who's older now, when he was young, we did some therapy. And I distinctly remember being in on a session and seeing the clinician typing, every sentence he gave the answer, she sat there and was typing furiously. And I certainly understand why she was doing it, but it definitely breaks rapport when you're looking down at your computer and trying to, do the check boxes while you're still listening to the individual's issues. So I think there's a balancing back, there's a dichotomy there. And the idea of using something like AI to let a clinician be an active listener and truly be listening and not be worrying about the clinical note that's not getting written. I think I can't overemphasize how huge of a support that can be.
I think you're exactly right. Some research we did a couple of years ago bears that out, that people's outcomes were better and they were more engaged in therapy longer when a clinician was using Ilios versus a clinician that was not using Ilios. I kind of conceptualize the issue of compliance is really, at least from Elios's perspective, a twofold challenge. One is at the point of care, as we're discussing. If you can help a clinician do that job better, they're going to probably write better notes. They're going to stay more engaged with the client professionally, et cetera. But there's also the back end auditing function and looking at, before a note goes out the door, having QI professionals take a look at it. And right now, most organizations are not equipped to do a 100% audit on every note that goes out, so they do a sampling procedure. You know a little bit about the compliance tool that Elios has. How do you see that as helping with this process?
Well, I think it's a game changer in several ways. I agree that, the idea of an organization auditing 100% of their notes is either not going to happen at all, or it would take so long to do it after the fact that it almost becomes irrelevant at that point. Every time you go into your electronic health record and you edit a note, there is an electronic footprint of that. So if somebody's going back in and, they flagged a note for either inconsistencies or incompleteness, and then somebody's editing that note weeks later, I mean, that's a concern, and that would be a red flag for any kind of an auditing regulatory agency to be seeing lots of edits on the back end that didn't happen contemporaneously. So having, 100% automation tool that would audit all of the notes, really is performing a functioning that's not happening now, just in reality. And number two, it's saving the job of somebody whose time could be better used elsewhere. But my understanding is you guys also have the great dashboard feature for this as well, which, from an HR and employer perspective, is a complete game changer in terms of reporting on data of, which clinicians may be habitually doing incomplete or belated notes or copying and pasting. And certainly it can let you know a lot more proactively which clinician may need some more support, may need some more training. It's a great feature to kind of weed out who's underperforming, reward those who are performing. So it's a good personnel tool as well as obviously the substance of the notes themselves.
I think one of the things I remember back when I ran an organization like Care Plus, when we had an audit, it was one thing to say we discovered an error, but auditors want to see what you did to remediate that problem. And so, like you said, these data give some actionable data upon which you can say, we found this, it was an error, we realized that, and here's what we did about it. And that's sometimes that's lacking, but you don't oftentimes we don't have tangible data that says it was, Joe Smith that was doing this. I agree with you. I think, management by data is a lot easier than managing without data. So there's lots of advantages, I think, to these tools. I think we could agree. Do you have any concerns about the use of AI in this space and, in terms of misuse or inappropriate use? What do you think? Is there kind of risk here?
There is always a risk anytime you're using a technology tool to potentially overuse it to take the place of critical thinking. AI should be enhancing, but not replacing human oversight. It can be the first draft of a note. It should not be the final draft. There needs to be a level of clinical expertise that weighs in on it. And as we see the technology evolve, I mean, Elios has always been at the forefront, but I have no doubt that as the technology evolves, it may even start providing even more prompting and even suggestions for maybe what the next steps would be in terms of a care plan. And especially once we get to that level of where there's suggested substantive next steps, the oversight, the human critical element, needs to be there. I also could see an issue with an organization that doesn't properly vet the AI company that they use. I mean, keep in mind that, we're not talking about gardening plans, like we're talking about things relating to protected health information. We're talking about highly regulated data that requires very stringent HIPAA compliance under our federal and state laws. Knowing that where the data rests, how the data is transmitted, if it's fully secured, and if there's any, let's say, active listening and recording, proper consents, all of those things need to be in place in order to legally and compliantly use a tool like this. I think these are all very important considerations.
Yeah, what are the kind of the most common errors that people make when they start thinking about these kind of tools? And maybe actually let's back it up. Let's say what are the most common errors that you see where people don't manage their compliance risk appropriately? Are there trends that you see that are more avoidable that you see a lot in your practice?
Well, you hope to never see a lot of major errors, but I would say, putting aside AI for a minute, just in general, what you'd find is that there's some kind of a payer dispute with one of the federal payers. So let's say Medicare or Medicaid, and then that will trigger an audit. And the problem is, they don't just audit the one claim that's at issue, they will do a much broader audit. So for somebody, an organization that's not proactive proactive with their compliance, they're really praying and hoping that an audit never occurs. Because once the audit does occur, they're going to find, once they peek under the hood, probably a much broader problem that could result in very, very significant penalties to the organization. Everything from Medicare, Medicaid paybacks to even loss of licensing if the issues are that egregious. So, proactive compliance and risk management is really critical to hopefully avoiding the audit or the payer dispute in the first place, but then also making sure that if an audit happens, because occasionally audits do happen, that it will be extremely limited, and that the auditing entity will find that really they've engaged in best practices for the most part.
I am in full agreement with everything you just said because it is no fun going through those audits and having to defend what you know is poor documentation by one of your employees. I mean, it's just no fun.
Right. Or sometimes if the audit is done several months or so after the fact, or even a few years after the fact, it may be that a person who's no longer an employee was responsible for some significant errors, including fraud. It's not unheard of for somebody to be fabricating sessions that may have been canceled, and a fraudulent note is put in. And with tools that didn't exist then but exist now, there's a better, hopefully, check and balance process of red flagging those types of issues that may occur, so that the organization doesn't find out about it a few years later when there's really no remediation to be done at that point. One of your prior questions, when you mentioned, the dangers of AI, or if there's a danger, and the one other piece that I would say is very important, it's a hot button issue, is just making sure that the algorithm that the model is trained on, what clinical information was put in to create it. Because, there's a concern about bias in AI models, and making sure that outcomes aren't skewed with a bias against, let's say, folks who might have socioeconomic issues or different racial disparities. The transparency behind a certain AI company's algorithm, I think, is important when you are evaluating how well you can trust basically the output from that organization.
Yeah, good point. I think those bias in AI is well, it's these things are built by humans. There's going to be bias. So the question isn't, have we eliminated all the biases? Do we have the tools in place to catch it and keep a kind of a continuous improvement process to remediate that? Are there issues, kind of like legal risks, that organizations might face if AI tools are improperly implemented?
Certainly, from a privacy perspective, misuse of PHI or HIPAA compliant safeguards would be a big one, because you're violating federal law there, likely state laws as well. New Jersey has pretty rigid data privacy laws as well that go hand in hand with HIPAA. If you have errors or mistakes in the algorithm that result in case notes that lead to, let's say, upcoding or fraudulent billing. So there certainly could be significant regulatory penalties, breach liabilities, if you have problems with privacy, data breaches, things like that. If Medicaid or Medicare, for example, believe that any fraud has been committed, and they, as you said, make a repayment demand, they're not going to make a repayment demand on one claim. They're going to aggregate it out based on a statistical percentage of how many of your claims are also false, and you're going to get a huge number that you're now going to have to try and defend against and prove why their percentage is not accurate. It's not a place you'd want to be in.
A good example is like that upcoding issue. We're seeing AI tools in the revenue cycle management space where companies will contract to come in and say, we will manage your claims processing. Like in more medically driven organizations, the way billing happens is so time dependent that if you're over 7 minutes, you can bill a different code or things like that. That to me seems like that a big risk, particularly for those RCM AI products when you start talking about money, the incentives are skewed a bit. I could see how that's a particular risk for the RCM AI companies out there.
No, I agree. I'm not as familiar with those because they are newer to the space, but I certainly can see where, if they're broadcasting themselves as being able to either save you money or make you more money, then you're wondering how they're doing that, and are they getting cute with the coding? The commercial payers and the federal payers are not stupid, and they will catch on to that eventually, and it could be problematic, especially if there's any allegations of, well, this is fraudulent billing. You didn't even do whatever it was that you coded for.
I love the getting cute with billing. That's probably the most understated euphemism I've heard for a long. Yeah, but I agree with you that the and frankly most of the RCM companies that I know of, when they go into an organization, they are just finding inefficient billing processes. Just like we can kind of expedite some of the routine stuff for documentation of clinical processes and then doing compliance on the back end, RCM can find inefficiency. They don't have to do anything inappropriate. They can literally find you didn't build this correctly and just point that out. If you can outsource them and do that better and cheaper, why not? And I think revenue cycle management is one of those things. Uh, Compliance is one of those things that we can help with in organizations as well. But I think
I agree.
there's lots of
Then we can honestly, I'm a huge adopter of AI. I think people that are afraid of AI, and I think they're going to be left behind. I believe within, I'm not even going to say 5 years, within 3 years, I think my entire legal profession will be turned fully upside down in a good way, because it imagine barriers to accessing legal services, meaning cost, and imagine certain functions that can be automated, and a basic project-based cost could be assigned to things that AI could do better than a human. It's a game changer. The balance, as we've been talking about, between overuse, underuse, what's the sweet spot? And I think that is the space we live in now, and we're all trying to ethically evaluate. I'm certainly not in any way saying that the revenue cycle management AI companies are there to defraud. I also agree with you 100% that imagine human error in billing efficiencies, just wrongly coding, forgetting a code, or even just untimely billing could be red flagged with an AI tool that says, hey, there's a whole federal arbitration process that, if you don't hit your deadlines, you've burned money. It's too late. And that's the same with all healthcare professions, that if you're not timely getting your billing done, some of that money is unrecoupable after the fact.
it's not the topic, but I am curious. I know in the healthcare space, one of the big concerns for clinicians is AI going to take my job? Do you see the same thing in the legal profession?
In some ways, yes. AI will never replace lawyers. What I believe AI will replace is cutting down research time, documents that can be very much automated and can plug in terms, transactional work. Certain things can be done by form. But the good thing about it is then lawyers are there for counseling. They're there for the interaction. They're not necessarily going to be there to have to bill 50 hours to create a motion. And again, that brings me back to the equity to accessing law, because if somebody can't afford to hire a lawyer to litigate what is, a real claim, if the cost of litigation is cut in half because it doesn't take the lawyer even half as long to prepare the relevant documents and motions, then again, the lawyer just needs to adapt by doing the part that the human component does need to provide, which is the strategy, the counseling, and all of that thing. So I'm not afraid of it in any way whatsoever. I think it's going to only enhance our practice. And I honestly feel bad for people um are afraid of it and feel like it's something to stay away from, because I think they're going to be at a disadvantage.
Your philosophy on this sounds very similar to ours and mine. That the goal of this is to help the clinician, provider, the lawyer in this case, do what only they can do and get kind of the routine stuff off their desk and provide better access in a parallel fashion. I do believe we're going to get, I don't know how quickly, but we'll get basic true counseling functionality in AI at some point for basic life problems, probably not serious mental illnesses and things like that. And we know the data show that people do interact well. Many people trust an AI counseling more than they trust a person because they don't feel like they have the risk of being judged.
Yeah, what I was gonna say was where I see the future of this going is really in the predictive capability. I like the idea of predictive compliance modeling, forecasting regulatory risk. I also would love to see AI be able to aggregate data based on documentation trends across populations to be able to say, like, this subset of patients are not getting their needs met. I think that we can find gaps of unmet population needs and be able to then use humans, because obviously, we still need humans to be able to create things to meet the needs of those who are being unmet. I mean, I see that as the future of AI.
And it's interesting on our side, on the behavioral health side, and you don't see any EHR vendors going out and going like doing longitudinal analysis backwards, both within a case and between cases to identify those trends. I know just for example, I just envision that you could do better suicide risk analysis by looking back at subtle cues that happened in the first, third, and 10th session that a person, the clinician, would not catch any one of those, but an analysis of those over time say, hey, this person's risk is increasing because I identified these trends. So I think it's the same thing. I think I don't know much about the legal profession, but it seems like the volume of case law that you and how much it changes and how much is generated would make it almost overwhelming to stay on top of that without some kind of technical assistance, AI being able to find the most recent cases relevant to a case you're working on at the time. I don't know. How do you guys do that now? I mean, is that where your assistants come in and you go out and they have to spend time in the legal library to find that stuff?
When I was first in law school, it would be starting out 24 years ago at this point, we did learn how to do legal research in actual books. But at that time, we also started training on Lexis and Westlaw, which were the two main legal search providers. So at this point, most people do not go in the physical books anymore. They use Lexis Westlaw or some of the other providers that have come out. Interestingly, both of those main companies have waded into the AI space in the past couple of years, where they might predict based on what your question is, what cases might help you. And they've gotten even more just in the past 6 months with, creating documents for you, very much AI based.
This has been fascinating, Laura. This and I'm just because of my own personal interest, I am fascinated by kind of like the parallel development in our professions of how AI is affecting us. And I really love your kind of view of how do we get the AIs to let lawyers do what only they can do, because that's exactly I think the best use case for all of this. And this has been just a fascinating discussion for me. So I want to thank you for spending time with us today, and good luck with your practice. I hope it does very well, and say hi
No,
to my
you're
friends in
very
New
welcome.
Jersey.
Absolutely. It has been such a pleasure. We're all on the cutting edge of the new age of, post AI. And it's a very exciting place to be right at the forefront of
It
it.
certainly is. Well, thank you, Laura, and I want to thank Brooke Andrus and Harrison Bach, our producers, for this episode of No Notes. And with that, we will call it a day.